It is a pleasure to be here at the Japan Society and preside over, I'm sure what is going to be an interesting and informative program. And as Mr. Sakurai had said, Chateaux is a consulting firm, and we're based in Westport, and we've been in this business for 30 years, which is a long time in the information technology business. We're members of Japan Society because we work with Japanese companies, or we work with companies that work with Japanese, with Japan, other companies in Japan, and so on. And our core expertise is in analytics, which of course everyone talks about these days. Big data, little data, and it touches every person every day. And we find that sometimes people know what they want and they just don't know how to get it. And sometimes, other times, they don't know what they want, but they do know how to get it. And we also know is that people who know what they want and they know how to get it, we call those people smart. But for everyone else, they need help. And that's what we do, is we help organizations to collaborate with analytics. And today's speaker, I want to introduce Phil Libin. Mr. Libin is an entrepreneur and the CEO of Evernote. And of course, Evernote is the one app for all devices. And now we talk about synchronicity. Before it was we had everything in different places. Now it's all in one place, even though it's many devices. And you collect information, you find what you need, you present your ideas to the world. Prior to joining Evernote, Mr. Libin founded and served as president of CoreStreet, a company that provided smart credential and identity management technologies to governments and large corporations. And he was also the founder and CEO of Engine 5, a leading Boston internet-based software development company. And he joins us tonight after recently starting 2 exciting partnerships with Nikkei and Itoen. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to please join me in welcoming Mr. Libin of Evernote.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Japan Society for inviting me. I've been looking forward to coming here and visiting for a long time. I am really very honored and very excited about the work that we're doing in Japan and about the opportunities that Japan has really presented to Evernote. We're a company that was deeply inspired right from the beginning by Japan, and continue to be inspired. And what is happening with us in Japan continues to be very influential to really set the direction for how the company is developed. And I want to just share a little bit about our journey so far and where I hope to go in the next few years. I think some of you probably know what Evernote is. To those of you who don't, what we're doing at Evernote is we're building a workspace. We want to be the next definition of what it means to be productive. We want to make productivity software for modern, busy people, for professionals, for knowledge workers that really let you work, let you accomplish all of the essentials that you do every day. And we think we're going about it in a different way from a lot of other companies. What we're really doing is we're challenging a lot of the old ideas about what productivity used to mean. Let me give you more specifics about that. The start of our industry of computer productivity was maybe about 35 years ago, when programs like WordPerfect and Microsoft Office really started being born. And the fathers of our industry, of the computer productivity industry, were faced with a very big challenge. They were faced with figuring out how to explain digital concepts, how to explain what computers could do to people who have never used the computer before, who had no familiarity with digital technology. How to bring an entire population, basically all of humanity, into the digital age. And this is a big deal. This is a big problem. And to do it, they had to reach for very familiar metaphors, very familiar concepts. And so to explain computing, and especially productivity in computing, they came up with concepts that were very close analogs to the physical objects that we used in offices before then. And so we got files and desktops and typewriters and slides and the inbox for email. All of these are physical ideas for things that we had, for things that we used in the office to be productive before computers. And they basically borrowed all of these ideas to explain computing to people who had never heard of it. And it worked. And it was an interesting thing to do, and it was necessary. But the question is now, are these old ideas still the best way to think about what you can do with a computer, what you can do with a smartphone, what you can do with the cloud? Is the idea of a filing cabinet still the right idea? Is the idea of a typewriter still the right idea? And we don't think it is. We think we've now had 30 years since the beginning of this industry. We've had an entire generation of people who are fundamentally comfortable with technology and who don't need the old physical concepts. In fact, we think the old physical concepts get in the way. By making you think about the constraints of physical objects in your technology, we think you are not living up to your potential to be as productive as you can be. So we started challenging the concepts of files. Do you really need files? Why should you think about what kind of a file something is? Shouldn't you care about the content of what's inside, not the program that would use to make it? Do you really need a filing cabinet? Do you really need a typewriter? When you're writing right now, do you really care about what things will look like on paper? You know, almost all writing programs are designed around the concept of paper. But you don't print anything out anymore. Why should you care about what something looks like on paper? Do you need a concept of a telephone? Should your communications device assume that it's a standalone product that you just use for communicating? And we don't think you do. We think that all of these concepts in a modern way of looking at it come together. So you don't need a tool for writing that's separate from your tool for researching, that's separate from your tool for collaboration. You should write and research and collaborate and communicate all in one thing, all as part of one holistic action. We call it a workspace, and it's what we're trying to build. And we've been at it for about 7 years now. And right from the beginning, we said our goal at Evernote was to build a 100-year startup. This was our mission right from the start. We said we want to make Evernote a 100-year startup. And we're about 7 years in, so we're about 7% done. We've got 93 years left to go. And we take it very seriously, this idea of building a 100-year startup. And this is the first point where we were deeply inspired by Japan. The idea of a 100-year startup really came to us from a couple of different ways. Evernote, as you heard in the introduction, Evernote is my third company, my third startup. And a lot of the same people that were with me for the previous companies are at Evernote. And my first company, Engine 5, we build e-commerce software. We built software for stores that wanted to sell things online. And that was pretty good. But, and we wound up selling the company. But we weren't a store. And so we weren't building a product for us. We weren't building something that we loved. We were building something for customers. And so we have to keep asking, what does the customer want? What does the market want? We weren't building it for us. And at the end, we sold the company. And so even the company, even after all that hard work, the company wasn't for us either. It was for somebody else. Then we started a second company called Core Street, where we build security software for banks and for governments. And that was very interesting, and it was important work. But we weren't a bank or a government, and so we weren't building things for us. We were building things for somebody else. We had to keep asking, what does the customer want? What does the market want? And at the end, we sold that company as well, and so even there, the company wasn't for us. And finally, the third time around, when it came time for Evernote, we said, what can we do differently? What if we build something for us? What if we only build a product that we wanted to use, so we don't have to ask, what does the market want? We don't have to ask what customers want. We just ask, what do we want? And we build a company that we want to keep. We build a product that we want to use, and we build a company that we want to keep. We don't want to have an exit. We want something to be our life's work. We want to build something that we can work on to make it our life's work and not think about exiting it and not have to worry about what do other types of people want. And the gamble that we took, the bet that we made, was that the way the world was just coming together around 2007 when we were getting started, the way the world was coming together with social media and with smartphones, we thought if we build something that we love, there's going to be another billion people in the world that love it as well. And because of social media and smartphones and things like that, those people are going to find out about us right away and be able to use us. And we would be successful just building what we wanted. But we had this idea of building something to keep. And it was on a trip to Japan that I really became inspired by the number of very old companies in Japan. And I did a little bit of research, very little, one Wikipedia page. So I did a lot of research. And it turns out there's like 3,000 something companies, like 3,200 companies in the world today that are more than 100 years old. And the vast majority, something like 2,900 of them are in Japan. Like Japan has the lion's share of companies that are more than 100 years old. And that's kind of cool. And so I got excited. I'm like, oh, that's great. And so I started looking into what are some of these companies. And it turns out that, yeah, most of these companies aren't actually that interesting. They're old. They're not particularly places where you'd necessarily want to work. A lot of them are family-owned businesses that are in traditional industries that have been going around for a while. But still, it's fascinating that it's a society that builds so many things that last for a long time. And we thought, okay, what if we combined the best of this culture, of this Japanese idea of building something to last, but we don't want to emulate it. We don't want to build a 100-year-old company. We want to combine it with the best Silicon Valley idea of the startup, of doing something that's innovative, that's fast-moving, that makes decisions quickly, that makes products that people love. So we combine those ideas and talk about a 100-year startup. Build a company that fundamentally combines those two things, something that is built to last and something that's built to innovate, something that's still a startup. And once we started thinking about it that way, we started finding lots of examples of companies in Japan and elsewhere that were thinking like this, that were really deeply inspirational. One of our earliest partners in Japan is a company called Ushiro Yoko. Some of you probably know. It's, technology and information technology and office products and supplies and educational company. It's sort of a medium-sized Japanese company. And I think they've been around for like 100 and something years now. I think when we met them, they were 101. I think now they're a little bit older. And it was really inspirational. I remember having a meeting at their headquarters in Tokyo, and it was in their new office, in their lobby. And in their lobby, they had this museum of like a display of the previous products. And so they had, imagine a semicircular room. So if you're standing there, imagine it's just like a big round half circle that you stand inside of. And along the wall, they just had years. And they had 100 years, kind of starting from the edge and going all the way up to the middle. They had 100 years labeled, and they had examples of their products for the past 100 years. And you could trace the development of the whole company for 100 years. And they had things that were information technology 100 years ago, which were things like physical, like filing cabinets and stuff like that, and slide rules and like really cool stuff. And they had examples for 100 years of kind of what they did. And then you can watch as it developed into more and more digital stuff. And now they're building CAD software and 3D stuff and really high-end things. And you could see they had this beautiful display of 100 years of their history of their products, which was amazing. But that ended right in the middle. And then the whole other side was blank, because it's like left room for the next 100 years. And it was a really moving experience for me. I remember standing there saying, like, I want one of those too. Like, I want to have a room at Evernote in 97 years that's going to show that kind of progression, that kind of pride and continuity of what we've been able to accomplish. But that also just assumes very naturally, like, oh, that's only the halfway point. There's still more to go. So a company that's 100 years old, but still very much innovative and aware of both its history and its innovation. And that was a very specifically Japanese idea. And then at that point, we started coming to Japan just because I love being in Japan. I love Japanese food. I love Japanese popular culture. A lot of my co-founders really love it there as well. And so we were sitting around our office in California one day, and really early on, and we were just looking at our numbers. And we noticed that there was a really slight blip in how fast we were growing in Japan. This was before we were even localized into Japanese. We just sort of looked and we said, oh, look, it's growing quickly in Japan. And it really wasn't. It was just like a little statistical blip. But that was the excuse we needed. We're like, oh, we got to go and find out what's going on. So we got on a plane and we got to Tokyo, and we just started talking to people. And we started meeting with bloggers and having dinners and going out drinking. And Japan is a country, and this is, I guess, my first piece of advice to Western companies that want to do business in Japan. There's a couple of things to understand about Japan from my perspective. One is Japan is a country of nerds. And in that way, it mirrors where the rest of the world is going. So the rest of the world, the whole world, is going into a direction where everyone's going to become a nerd. Everyone's going to become a geek. Because everyone is super passionate about something. Everyone has something that they care much more about than they should. That's kind of the definition of what a nerd is. And everyone is like that. And technology is now letting everyone kind of express that and figure that out and come together. And things that maybe you care about, that maybe you're only one of a million people that cares about it. But if you're one of a million people that cares about it, there's 7,000 other people on the planet that care about it as well. And now you can connect with them. So everyone's becoming a nerd. And when you build products for nerds, which is what Evernote is, it was really important to kind of see that experience accelerated. And in Japan, like, everyone was a nerd way before the rest of the world. Everyone in Japan is super passionate about something. It's something different. But everyone has some kind of a passion, some kind of a hobby, and it could be food, and food is actually a major one for, like, I would say 60% of Japanese people are probably crazy about food in one way or another, and there's like 1,000 different categories of that. But of something, it could be anything. And so seeing how people used Evernote about their passion, about the thing that was really important to them, was really an eye-opening education. We went from thinking ourselves as a note-taking company to thinking of ourselves as, wow, we help you with your life's work. We take whatever is most important to you, and we help you do the best at your life's work. And Japan was a concentrated study of that. Of course, we have nerds everywhere else, in the US and in Europe, and we find it, but being in Japan was just being surrounded with them. It was a very sensory-rich experience of instant use cases. Everywhere we turned to Japan and saw how somebody was using Evernote, it was an amazing use case that we hadn't thought of before. You know, there was a hairstylist that used Evernote really early on in Tokyo to take pictures of all of her clients, and she would keep an Evernote notebook that had like pictures of all the clients kind of before and after. And when people came in, she can flip forward and say, well, this is what she looked like. Do you want this haircut or that haircut? I'd never heard of that. That's a great use case. She was using Evernote actually for her business, for work, in a really creative way. There was all sorts of stuff like that. And we found that if we just approach Japan as this country of geeks, of nerds, in the best possible way, I say that with as much love as I can because I'm a giant nerd myself, things really started to make a lot more sense. The second thing that we learned about Japan, for companies that wonder how to be successful in Japan, is it is a country of enthusiastic nerds. And it's a country that reciprocates enthusiasm, which means this is how it would work. We would go to Japan and we would go to a restaurant. Favorite restaurant, one of my favorite restaurants is Tokyo, but the first one that we actually went to, the launch of sort of Evernote in Japan, was in a back room at a restaurant called Buragumi, which I guess means pork team, which is a great name. It's a pork shabu-shabu restaurant in Tokyo, and we had a lot of meetings there. And so we would sit with some bloggers, and I would be excited about being in Japan, because here's I was in Japan, and there was this amazing pork in front of me, and it was this exciting. And they would be excited about me being excited. And then I would be excited that they were excited. And then they would be even more excited because I was excited that they were excited. And it was this reciprocation of enthusiasm that is infectious over there, that builds on itself. So like the main thing that you have to do as a Westerner to try to have a shot in Japan is just go there and be happy and show that you're happy and let people see that. And then they'll become happy, and then they'll want to talk to you some more, and then you'll want to talk to them, and it builds on itself like nowhere else in the world. And that was really the strategy. Like, our Japan entry plan was just go there and be happy. And I think that's an underutilized plan. I think actually a lot of companies kind of overthink how to do this, when basically for us that was the key. Now, we were super fortunate that we had some great people helping us in Japan. So Hitoshi Hokamura, who's over here, is our chairman of Evernote Japan, and we met him very early on, and he was sort of masterminded a lot of what we did in Japan, but also everywhere else in the world, in really just very, very interesting ways. What we did in social media in Japan was ahead of what we did anywhere else in the world. How we interacted with media, with reporters, the events that we have. We would have press conferences. We'd never had press conferences anywhere. I'd never had a press conference until we had one in Japan, and like 100 journalists showed up with like TV camp crews and everything. It was kind of amazing. But we took this simultaneously very seriously. It was very important, and with a great deal of enthusiasm because it was crazy and it was fun. And that's kind of the approach that I sensed in a lot of what's best about Japan, is this like real dedication, real commitment to hard work, real attention to detail in the service of something that you are very enthusiastic about. So we were inspired by Japan by the idea of longevity, the idea that you can make something for 100 years. We were inspired by Japan by the idea of the life's work. You know, when we were getting started, we launched Evernote in 2008. We were raising money in 2007, 2008, and it was terrible. We had a really hard time raising money. Basically, Silicon Valley VCs would not talk to us. Actually, we were raising money at the very worst of the financial crisis, like October of 2008. And I was really bad, still I'm pretty bad at pitching, at raising money, so we just got nowhere. Our pitch to investors basically looked like this. I would go in and I would say, hi, I'm Phil Libin. You never heard about me, but we've got this great idea. It's called Evernote. And we're going to use computers and phones and PDAs to help you write stuff down and remember things. And we're going to give it away for free. And usually that was enough to get thrown out of the investor's office. But sometimes, just out of being polite, the investors would say, like, oh, I see, and who's your competition? And I had a great answer to this. I would say, well, pretty much every single computer or phone or device that's ever been released already has a pretty good free note-taking application on it. So it's kind of infinite competition that's already pretty good and free. And then we would definitely get thrown out. But what we, among our very first investors, in fact, our first institutional investors, was Docomo, which was kind of crazy. So out of nowhere, I got a tweet from Docomo Capital in Silicon Valley, saying like, "Hey, we'd like to come in and talk to you about Evernote." Wow, great, come on in. And it turns out that like they were just people at Docomo who just liked using Evernote. They just liked the product, and they saw some bloggers writing about it because we were over there and we had, had a good dinner, and they just wanted to find out about investing. And it's kind of crazy. Like, no one in Silicon Valley took Docomo Capital seriously as an investor back in 2008. They weren't a brand name VC. It was a Japanese company. I had no idea. I didn't even know like what they would be interested, but they came in, and we had a meeting. And I remember the first meeting really well. And this is how we convinced Docomo to invest. So if any of you are American companies and you want to get Docomo to invest, this is how we did it. It may or may not work for you. I had the meeting with one of my co-founders, my CTO, Dave, and they showed up at our office. So several people from Docomo, and it was very impressive because they're all wearing suits because they're very Japanese. And they came in, and there was some bowing, and it was just me and Dave there, and we sort of walked them into the conference room. We had this really like run-down, terrible first office space, and we were being very polite to them. They come in, and I offered them to take a seat, and I turn my back, and I hear Dave in back of me speaking Korean to the Docomo people. Dave's not Korean, Dave's American, but I hear him saying something in Korean, and I realize that it's Korean because we had just been in Korea, and I kind of turn and look at him like, what are you doing? And he realizes what he just did. He was trying to say thank you in Japanese, but he had just been in Korea, and he just randomly said some Korean. And he realized, oh my God, I just spoke Korean at random to these Japanese people from Docomo, and he felt terrible. And he just like turned completely white and started apologizing and felt terrible about it. And they felt terrible about him feeling terrible. Because Japan is a very emphatic society. It's like the positive feelings bounce back, but sort of the negative ones. And so they felt so bad that he felt bad, that they were like, no, it's okay, of course we understand, it's no problem, but like, and then he saw how bad they felt, and he felt worse. And then they felt worse, and so there was this cycle of people just feeling bad about it, and the only way out of it was for them to just give us $4 million, and so there was no hard feelings. And so I'm pretty sure that was the secret of it, but regardless of whether it was that or something else, they did wind up investing in us when no one else did. No one else would have any confidence. We recently just did a partnership with Nikkei, a company that's been around for more than 100 years. A very traditional company, but one that is very innovative and is very trying to innovate. And they did a partnership, which is I guess it's a common phrase in Japan, but I'd only heard it in relation to this deal. It's a business and capital alliance, which I think is a really elegant phrase. So it's a business partnership where we do work together. We include their content in Evernote and vice versa, and it's capital alliance, so they invested money as well. And we just announced that a couple of weeks ago, and I tried to get Dave to speak Korean to them just to make sure to close the deal, but he wouldn't do it. But we got the money anyway, so it turned out okay. But the investors in Japan had faith in us before anyone else did, because they liked the product. And then we started going over there, and the usage just started growing. And of course, it was hard work. Like we did have to. It wasn't like we didn't do anything. We did a lot, and I spent a lot of time over there. And we were, we were careful to hire a great team over there. And but the success came from the hard work plus the enthusiasm, and that's a model that we've just used as a model for the company everywhere. The other way that we were really inspired kind of by Japan is by individual people who have really been great mentors to me. So pretty early on, I met Hiroshi Mikitani, the founder and CEO of Rakuten, and he became a mentor and eventually an investor in Evernote. And he was and is an amazing influence, not on how to do business in Japan, but really on how to think of yourself as a global company, as a fundamentally global from the beginning. That like we weren't an American company, a Silicon Valley company doing business in Japan, and we certainly weren't going to pretend to be a Japanese company. Like we were a company that was global right from the beginning. That everything we did fundamentally was to build a global company and to build a culture that understands and appreciates that. And now we have 11 offices in 9 different countries. Japan was the first major market outside of the U.S., but since then we've opened up offices in Beijing and in Seoul and in France and in Brazil and in Singapore and in other areas. But it all came out of this model, out of this Mikitani-san inspired idea that we were just global right from the beginning. And we learned an important lesson there as well, which is against the conventional wisdom of all the advice that we got. Basically, a lot of the advice that we got from Japan was, you can't make the same product in Japan that you have in the US. Japanese tastes are different. Japanese people don't like the same kind of stuff. It has to be heavily modified for Japan. And we heard exactly the same thing about China as well. But we heard it first about Japan, that it has to be different. It has to be heavily localized. And the truth is, it doesn't. Like, this is just not true. And think about it like this. Last year I was visiting a bunch of our offices, and I was in China, and I noticed that there was a lot of GM cars in China, just a lot of GM cars in the street. And the GM cars in China are different than the GM cars here. They're different models, different makes. They're just different. They're obviously for the Chinese market. And then I was in Brazil and noticed there's a lot of GM cars in South America, and the cars there are different. The GM cars there are different names, models. They look different from the ones in China or the ones in the US. And the ones in Europe are different. So GM, a global company, spends a huge amount of time making specific products that meet local tastes, that meet local markets. And obviously it works for them, because if it didn't, why would they spend billions of dollars a year making different products for different countries? But BMW sells the same cars everywhere. And Apple sells the same products everywhere. And Evernote has the same products everywhere. And I think the lesson for us is local differences in taste matter at the low end. If you have a mediocre product and you're trying to sell more of it, then yeah, you can probably sell more of it by really thinking about differences in local tastes. But if you instead use that same energy to just make a product that's so good that everyone loves it, if you aspire to make something that's great for everyone in the world, then everyone actually will use it and love it the same way. And so the product that we have in Japan is the same. The product that we have in China is the same. And the product that we have in Turkey and in Brazil is the same. And that's not easy. It's not that it's like you would think, oh, it's easier not to have to change a product. It's actually much harder because it forces you to make the product better everywhere. And this is probably the most useful thing for us in Japan is the feedback. Our Japanese users are some of the most active users of Evernote in the world, but they're also probably the most vocal. They're the ones that complain the loudest and the first about everything. And they give tons of feedback, both good feedback and negative feedback. And in fact, the culture in Japan is that products ought to be great, that you should always strive to make something a little bit better. And if you have some imperfections, it is your duty to improve it and to make it better. And our users in Japan are our best source of information about how to improve the products for everyone. So we don't take the feedback that we get from Japan and try to make a product that's better for the Japanese market. We're not in Japan to sell things to Japanese people. We're in Japan because Japan is one of the crucibles, one of the centers of innovation. And being in Japan helps us make a great product that we can sell everywhere in the world. And it would be much harder to do without being in Japan, without listening to our users, without listening to our partners. And we do have some of the most innovative partners in the world in Japan, many of them companies that have been around for 100 years, not all. And we have the most engaged users that really help us make a fantastic product. The last thing that I want to say, that I want to close on, and then I'm very happy to take any questions about anything, is another myth that, for us at least, we've completely disproven, it hasn't been true, which is the myth that it's really difficult to deal with Japanese companies. I hear this all the time. Oh, it's going to be hard to deal with Japanese companies because, they move so slow and it takes forever to make a decision and the negotiations are so complicated. Like, it's really tough to deal with Japanese companies. You really have to have patience. We heard this over and over and over again. And there's kind of a happy thing there and a sad thing there. The happy thing is it's not true. Easy to deal with Japanese companies, easier than with any other companies in any other country in our experience. It doesn't mean that it's like you don't have to do anything. Of course you do. You have to have a good product, you have to negotiate. But actually what we found is that in dealing with Japanese companies, they're pretty straightforward. Like, the negotiations are pretty straightforward. Like, you're more or less dealing in good faith the whole time. That is not true of many other parts in the world. They're not trying to screw you. They're not even trying to obscure anything. You pretty much know what people are saying is kind of the truth. It's relatively easy to say, okay, this is what we want to accomplish together. Yeah, it takes a few meetings and you have to go drinking a little bit and you have to build a relationship, but you have to do that everywhere. It is not true that they're slower. We have done major deals with big Japanese companies. Our deal with Nikkei that we just announced, that was 6 months or something from beginning to end, from the first meeting to the largest investment that they've ever done. It's less than 6 months with a lot of work from both sides there. That is much faster than a lot of our deals with Western companies. Our deal with Docomo, that was a many-year relationship that's now in its 6th year. But our deal with Docomo happened years before any other telecom anywhere else in the world dealt with us. Yeah, now we have deals with a lot of other operators, but Docomo was the first by years they were willing to do it. So the good news is that it's just not true. If you think that dealing with Japanese companies is harder or takes longer than any other companies anywhere in the world, it just doesn't. The sad thing, that's the good news. The sad news is the people who told me this, they were almost all Japanese. This is where Japan is today. The only people who have a bad opinion of Japan are Japanese people. The image of Japan, I think, in Silicon Valley and the rest of the world is really excellent. Now, it's sort of seen as, it's a little bit exotic. It's like the elves in Lord of the Rings. It's like, oh, they have really nice stuff and a little bit sad sometimes, but you don't really understand why. But people love Japan. When I come back from Japan, people are excited to hear about everything and to see the pictures and to see all the cool stuff. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm, except in Japan. You talk to Japanese people in Japan, and they're all like, oh, yes, everything is very slow, and you sort of feel like they feel like it's in decline, and it isn't. I think what we can do at Evernote, and as just startups doing business in Japan, is engage and tell, I've told all of my friends who are CEOs of other companies and investors, you should be in Japan. It's fun, it's easy, it's a lot easier than trying to get into China or even Europe. It's pleasant, you should just do it. We've had lots of companies who've invested in Japan because we've encouraged them, and they've really been benefited for it. And to actually, while in Japan, try to convey some of the sense of excitement that people outside of Japan feel about it to people there. Because I think the country needs more optimism, and I think it richly deserves it. So with that, thank you very much.
Your experience about being working in Japan, and
would you like some tea? It's 5 times better.
Well, I want to save that for all the other people. There's only one.
It's true. We can pass it around.
Yeah, we could. Shared enthusiasm around tea.
That's right.
So this could have been titled Myth Busting in Japan, because many of the things that you're talking about are the legend versus what your experience has been.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's myths around every place. There's myths around China. Right. There's myths around everywhere. But Japan, I think, is that's the biggest gulf between how scared people told us we should be versus the reality. That's the biggest difference is in Japan.
Right. And it's my experience too. Is Japanese folks who tell us, oh well, working with Japanese companies is really hard to do. It's very difficult. And I share that experience that it's not.
Yeah. Right. Everything worthwhile is hard, but comparatively to other things you could be doing, when you compare the impact, Japan is a huge market. If you compare the impact that you can have by being over there to the difficulty, it's just obviously and clearly worth it for, I think, many, many companies. Yeah. And they're scared away for some reason.
And what you said about not having an exit strategy, I think that's foreign to a lot of folks. I'm sure in Silicon Valley, what's your exit strategy? And you're like, I don't have one.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have all sorts of jokey answers to that, because you get that question all the time, right? Yeah. And so I would say people don't ask anymore, but I would get that question, it's what's your exit strategy? And I would say something like, oh, we're still trying to figure out our entrance strategy, haha, and people would go, haha, and I would never know how to answer that. But then I realized, actually, this is an investor concept, right? So exit is an investor concept that is investor terminology, and it's polluting entrepreneurship. This is not an entrepreneurial concept. What they're really asking about is liquidity, which is a totally legitimate question.
How am I going to get my money back out?
When do I get money? What is the liquidity? But that's not an exit. You can have liquidity without exiting. The word is super harmful, and it's an investor concept because they're talking about the exit of that capital so they can get liquidity. But entrepreneurs think of it as exit, I leave the company and do something else. Right. And that's a really weird way to think about your life's work.
Right. When I've been asked that question, sometimes I say, well, do you mean yours or mine?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it's good to clarify it. I usually try to say, let's talk about liquidity instead, because that's a much happier conversation.
Right. So you had this experience out in, over in Japan and going over there. Did it change your mindset around moving or working in the U.S. from what you previously had?
Yeah, being in Japan is really inspiring in lots of ways. It's definitely affected our aesthetic of the product, completely. Some of the culture is, some of the cultural things that we picked up in Japan, we were able to take over, but others not. I'm not saying that everything about Japan and Japanese culture, and certainly not work culture, is good. There's a lot of problems over there, and a lot of the things we do totally differently. We did our, this is great. We did our first press conference with Docomo. So Docomo invited us to speak at they do a big annual event every year, and the CEO, I think back then it was Yamada-san, gives a big keynote, and it's sort of their giant conference.
and we were invited to present it, and it was like the first time that they had a Western company on stage with the CEO, and it was kind of this big deal. And they said, okay, so there's going to be this conference. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put out a press release like a week before, telling everyone that you're going to be there and what you're going to talk about. And then when the reporters show up to the conference, we're going to give them like your printed remarks ahead of time. And then Yamada-san is going to get on stage and say what you're going to say. And then you're going to get on stage and say what it is that you said. And then we're going to like issue another summary. And I'm like, so you're going to like communicate what I'm going to say like 4 times before I say it. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well, that's really like, that's not particularly good theater. Like, no one's going to be surprised at that point. Like, yeah, but this is the way that the company's always done it. And Hitoshi was negotiating at this point, and he said, well, but really we think it'd be better if you made a surprise. Like, say there's going to be a surprise speaker, they'll get a lot of interest, but then don't tell people what Phil is going to say, and then just have him say it, and it'll be much better. And they're like, no, we couldn't do that.
Right.
And then Hitoshi played the wild card, which works all the time for him in Japan. He said, well, that's how Steve Jobs would have done it.
Right.
And so they agreed, and they did it that way, and it was like the best press conference they ever had. But it was this idea that, like, yeah, for 50 years they've been doing it in this way with like that was intended to have no news, no surprises, as steady as possible. But they were willing to make the change, even though it took a lot of convincing.
And the mindset around the product is around spontaneity and synchronization. And if when you think about your workspace, it is encouraging people to be more spontaneous. Yeah. Oh, well, where am I? Does it really matter?
I think, I don't know about spontaneous. I think that's an interesting way of putting it. I really think about it as working in the moment.
Right.
So I get this from a lot of things, but I spent some time in Kyoto, visiting some of the tea gardens and the temples there, and I was really interested in this idea, this sort of very Zen idea of living in the present. Putting aside the past, putting aside the future, and just live in the present. It's a very elegant concept. And I thought, like, what would it mean to work in the present? Like, is there an equivalent for working? Like, is there a way that you can work in the present, work in the moment? And I thought that's like the opposite of email, right? Because like when you're working out of your inbox, it's the opposite, because your inbox is a list of things that you're already behind on, sorted in the wrong order. So like when you're working through your inbox, you are always already behind, already in the past. It's high stress. But when you're a startup, you get this opportunity occasionally to work in the present, to work more spontaneously, but really like what is the highest impact thing that you can be doing right now? And don't worry about what you did 20 minutes ago. What is the highest impact thing you're doing right now? And we definitely are building Evernote, this workspace concept, to give you this idea that you can get a lot of work done in the present. Like right now, what is the best thing you could be doing, and you should do it.
It's like my children. They're the same thing. You talk to them about what they did yesterday, and they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about what they're doing tomorrow, right? Or what they're doing right now. And then you say squirrel, and they run in another direction.
Yeah, I'm like that too.
Right, okay. And so you're bringing this to the product itself, and really it is a product that is created from a fundamental view that really transcends the boundaries of how we think in terms of global. Being global as a culture is not being local anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So we do not have a goal to make Evernote better for Japanese users.
Right.
We just don't. We have a goal of making Evernote better for everyone, and we want our Japanese users to help us do that for everyone.
Right.
And the number one question I get when I travel internationally is, how are users in this country different? So like I'll go to Romania and I'll talk to Romanian reporters and I'll be like, oh, but how are users in Romania different than users everywhere else? And I'm like, we're just not. Like the kinds of people that we get at Evernote, which are the modern knowledge professionals, they're actually the same. Like they use the same in Romania as they do in Japan, as they do in Turkey, as they do in Brazil. And yeah, there's like minor differences, but for the most part, like it's really the same, and we try to make it great for that core user base. The differences are around like when people take lunch. So like in Brazil, like we can see like a pretty people in Brazil take like a 2-hour lunch, and we can sort of see the usage like during the day. People in Japan take lunch, as far as we can tell, on Wednesdays. So like it's basically nothing noticeable. And then there's like maybe 40 minutes on a Wednesday where it's like a little bit lower, and then it's so there's like differences like that, but for the most part it's really the same everywhere.
So you can really judge. You can look at the trends around the globe by looking at your analytics.
Yeah, we are not a big data company, so we have a very firm policy that we have no access to individual user or company data. We don't data mine it, and we never look at like anyone's actual data. Like that, your information is yours, it's not ours.
Right.
So we get as much overall intelligence as we can from looking at kind of big trends and trying to make that smarter. But there's a fine line. I mean, and you guys know that from what you do. Like, there's a very fine line between like saying your data is yours. Like your customer data is your customer's property. It's not our property. It's not ours to do with as we want. It's yours, and you retain all the rights to it. That's fundamentally important. Everything is private. We don't monetize your data. At the same time, like, how do we have all of this information? How can we be smarter about it? How can we make more elegant products, without compromising any privacy or security? And that's always a fine line.
And it's a macro view versus a micro view.
Yeah.
So are there any questions from folks in the audience that you might have at this time? So I think you said the number 1 question was in Romania. So the number 2 question should be here.
Yeah, there you go.
So maybe we got a question right there. So if you could we'll get the mic out, and if you can say who you are and where you're from, and then a question.
Hi, my name is Kent, and I'm from South Carolina, visiting the city. Those companies that you said that lasted about 100 years, you said majority of them were in Japan. On your research, or if you did any research, did anything stick out as to why so many companies in Japan have longevity?
Well, I think, so a lot of them, so not the majority of them, the vast majority of them are in Japan. Something like, 85, 90%. So it's like ridiculous majority are in Japan. And most of them are family-owned businesses, right? So most of them stick around because you start the company as a family, and it's like you started to pass it on and to make it last. Like you don't, like those kinds of companies are typically not started to make money. They're started as a fundamental life's work. But more than just your life's work, it's like your family's work, it's your generational work. And it's just, why in Japan? Because that's an idea in Japan.
Trades.
That's less of an idea in other parts. I think that probably used to be the case. That probably used to be more the case in Europe, back when you had, guilds and things like that. And I think just Japan was able to preserve some of that.
Sure, the names that people have, like Shoemaker. My name is Shoemaker. My name is Carpenter. And that was often signified not just who they are, but who their forebears were and what tradition they were passing on.
The Japan economy took it in a slightly more advanced place because these weren't just like family, individual occupations. These are companies.
Right.
And so they were just, it's a stable legal system that goes back for a while. There's not that many countries that have a stable legal system that goes back for the hundreds of years that it would take to actually say, okay, this is a company entity that's been around for a while. But Japan produces the vast majority of them. But again, like, that's really cool, but it isn't that most of these companies are anything that we'd want to emulate. So we're really trying to combine this with a startup idea.
Yeah, it's a concept you're then turning into a larger idea. We have someone else who raised his hand. Yes?
Howard Euro, New York. I was remarking your curious assertion that, quote, you don't print anything out anymore.
Yeah, I probably overstated that case. Let's say that you print a whole lot less than you used to. And I think that, look, I'm old enough to remember, word processors, where when I would use a word processor, like in high school and in college, I would say 90% of that, the end result was I would print it and hand it to someone. And so if 20 years ago I was printing 90% of the things that I'm working on, like the words that I typed 20 years ago, probably 90% wound up on paper. 10 years ago, it was probably down to 20%. Now it's far less than 1%. It's maybe 1/1000th of 1%. So what do I print? Yeah, occasionally, once in a really rare while, I still do print. But it's become a tiny fraction of my work. Now, if you are a print journalist, then sure, a lot of the work you do gets printed, and that's great. Like, we've got partnerships with Wall Street Journal, with Nikkei, with others that have very rich print traditions. And in fact, Japan is probably the last place on earth where actual print journalism is still a very dominant and important form. But that isn't how most people work. So I would say if you're in the business of printing stuff, then it's probably more than 1% of your words. But for the average knowledge worker, it'd be interesting for someone to do this research. I don't know, maybe there's a Wikipedia page about it somewhere. But my guess is that far less than 1% of the words that an average person in this room writes will get printed on paper. But the tools that we use to write still behave as if they expect you to hit the print button. And they still like waste your time with margins and formatting and justification and stuff like that, where they really should be giving you things that are more useful for what you actually want to do.
Now, does this mean that as you are looking at these metaphors or these ideas, folders and files, and which all have their roots in physical things, are you actively looking to say what can we do away with, or are you making them irrelevant just by not thinking about them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept, right? And it's also a very there's an interesting Japanese and Zen concept of what can you take away, right? And how the product is defined. Apple probably the best known Japanese company,
right?
Right, love the idea is, or a company that could not have existed without the deep influence from Japan, and could not have existed obviously without China. But the concept of products being defined by what they don't have, and so the first iMac, the central thing about it was that there was no floppy drive. Right. That's a really kind of deep idea. So another thing that Apple did really helped. Obviously, Android and other people did this, other companies did this as well. But remember, about 2 years ago, there was this big move away from something called skeuomorphism. So if you remember, the old versions of iOS, they were very skeuomorphic, which is sort of a design word for things computer things that look like physical objects. So it was a whole lot of fake leather textures and stitching and fully rendered 3D glass things, and there was all these bookcases. They were that's called skeuomorphism because it's a cool word. So everything was highly skeuomorphic in the beginning days of iPhones, and it was actually interesting. Apple had a great reason for doing it. They did it because they could, and nobody else could. Because it was exceptionally hard to make good-looking, fully rendered 3D things, and nobody else could. Samsung didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the designers that could make really beautiful skeuomorphic objects in little app icons, and Apple could, and so they did it as a way to show the quality.
Right.
But a couple of years ago, it really fell out of favor because it was just cluttered and it was just kind of weird. Why do you need these kinds of concepts? And so there was a lot of talk of moving away from skeuomorphism. And iOS 7 and iOS 8 and most of the modern systems are much flatter, much less skeuomorphic. But that only goes halfway because this is visual skeuomorphism. There's a deeper thing called cognitive skeuomorphism, which is what ideas are rooted in outdated physical constructs. And we've done away with a lot of the visual skeuomorphism, but cognitive skeuomorphism is still entrenched in the way that we think about computing, and it can't disappear overnight, and some of it makes sense, but as much as possible, anything that's a physical object, that the concept is of a physical object, you really got to think about, is that the best way to think about this issue? And for the most part, it isn't, and it's important to start peeling those things away.
Right. There was a famous artist, Picasso, and he did that 50, 60 years ago, where he said he'll take away everything from an image to the point where you could still recognize it, but it wasn't what he originally set out to do. So with the bull, famous bull, right? So you're taking the same concept where you're removing the pieces, and then you get to the essence of what it is, and now it's more useful. Is that right?
And definitely in the development of art styles and history, it sort of trended a similar great course of heavily, first there was no realism because people didn't know how to do it. They didn't understand perspective, right? And so you look at cave paintings or really primitive stuff, old iconography, it's not realistic because people didn't actually understand how to draw things realistically. And then you had kind of around the Renaissance, people figured out perspective and other ones, and you had this all of a sudden everyone was oh, we can make things look really realistic. And so you had things leading up to Norman Rockwell and others that were just more and more and more visually high fidelity. But then, starting several hundred years ago, there were several movements away from it. And, Picasso is a good example of it. Early on in his career, it was actually pretty realistic. Traditional and realistic, but that wasn't the interesting thing. Now, let me say, we're not making art. Evernote does not make art. Art, in many ways, leads these ideas. And so you see developments in art and culture before you'll see them in work products. So we don't think of ourselves as artists. We do think of ourselves as artisans. We think of ourselves as really trying hard to make something good, always failing at it, never being quite as good as we want, but constantly kind of working towards improving it, and very much being inspired by some of the artistic and architectural movements that come decades earlier.
Another question? Yes. Let's see if we can get a mic so everyone can hear.
Have you had any problems with copyright at all?
Have we had any problems with copyright? Not really. So, we have, Evernote isn't really for publishing things. We're really about your private information and for collaborating with, coworkers. So there are ways that you can publish content more broadly, but that's a very limited use case. And so it's really just not the place where you would violate copyright if you wanted to. Like, it's not a great way to publish things. Having said that, there are certainly cases where someone puts up some copyrighted material and puts a public link to it in Evernote, and we have the takedown procedures to comply with the laws for that. And so we deal with that all the time, but it's fairly limited. We get a handful of cases. But I think it's basically because Evernote is just not a good tool for that. Not because of any other, not because of anything particularly smart that we've done.
So you're a copyright lawyer and you want to talk to Phil afterwards, is that right? Another question.
Hi. Question about rising above what we classify as Me Too products. So you got Dropbox, you got Box.
Those are great products. I'm not casting any dispersions on really good companies, and yeah. Sorry, I don't know. I'm sure that. Let me let you finish before I jump in.
So
I am a big fan of Drew and of Aaron, of those two companies.
Oh, without a doubt. So what I'm getting at is that your product is extremely elegant and it's very cross-platform. Most of these other solutions tend to be more vertically focused, and I'm more curious how do you continue to iterate and to enable such a elegant solution to progress that while others seem to kind of be more verticalized?
Well, first of all, thank you for thinking that it's elegant. I'm glad you think that. It never seems that way from the inside. I think one of the core things is I am perpetually grumpy and dissatisfied with the state of the products, and to me, it's always I feel a combined sense of pride and embarrassment, when I look at them, because I know what I want them to be, I know what they can be, and I know that they don't live up to that, and I'm kind of we're constantly striving to improve it. It's sort of like, it's like mariners, like sailors, navigating in the old times by looking at the North Star. You're looking at the North Star and sailing towards it, not because you intend to get there, but because it's the direction that you want to go to. So we have this clear idea of what we can be. We know we're never going to achieve it, but we can kind of get further. But then there's specifics that we do. So we have multiple teams. We have something like 25 different shipping apps or versions, and so I think we have something like 17 or 18 active teams in the company, development teams, and each one is relatively small. 5 to 8 people tends to be the sweet spot. The way that we like to think about it is the ideal number of people to build something is the same as the ideal number of people that you could have over for dinner. And so if you think about just how many people can you sit at your table and have dinner with and still have one conversation, and it really tops out at about 8. It's like when you have 10 people, it's not one conversation anymore. When you have 10 people around a big table, you sort of have a conversation going on over there and a conversation over here. But when you have 5 to 8 people, you can have a conversation, and building a product is really a 9-month-long conversation among these 8 people. So we have small teams. We work on things for roughly 9 months at a time. For the first version, too much longer than that, and the product gets worse. And so what it turns out is we are pretty good at building things that 8 really talented people can build in 9 months. And we suck at building things that you can't build like that. So we don't make spaceships. Luckily, the way the world works right now, there's a lot of really important stuff that 8 really talented people can build in roughly 9 months. And kind of that's what we optimize for. And the teams compete with each other for good ideas. We don't strive for code reuse. We're not trying for reduce the work on the developers. We don't want consistency. Consistency is a weird thing. If you strive for consistency, you wind up achieving it through mediocrity. Everything just becomes consistently sucky, and then you're like, oh, everything is the same. But yeah, it's the same because you've defaulted to the lowest common denominator.
You don't want to dumb it down.
Yeah, so we just sort of say each product is meant to be the best example of what it could be on that platform, and then the teams shamelessly steal each other's best ideas, and that works pretty well. It's really expensive. We spend much more on product than most companies do at our size, But I think it's still a good investment for us because the product is most of the marketing. And so the investment in the product, by making the product a really good example of what we can do natively on each device and platform, we get the much larger companies, which are the device and platform makers, to feature us as the showcase example, and that gets us hundreds of millions of dollars of free marketing. So we spend, tens of millions of dollars spent on the product gets us hundreds of millions of dollars in free marketing as a result of it. So that's it seems to be a good trade-off.
It's a very different paradigm from most other companies and there are some really good examples of like Lotus, where it was small group, big group, and right? And so you're really leveraging some of the knowledge before.
Yeah, and I am very shameless about just asking for advice. So I will, but at every opportunity, approach people that have done much greater things than I ever will, and said, hey, like, what did you learn? What were the mistakes you made? And I talk quite a bit to Ray Ozzie about what life was like early on. There was a lot of lessons that you can learn from that. And and we're going to make a colossal amount of mistakes as well, and I hope to be able to pass those on in entertaining ways to people.
But it seems, but that's working, and really approaching not, as you said, the local market, but a more global market. You can do that because the mistake potentially that you made here may not have been a mistake, but it could be a learning exercise that you then move somewhere else, and that really helps the overall product.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I think maybe we have just one more. So that
How many do we have?
Let's maybe make that.
This would be the last one.
My name is Daisuke from Itochu, and Itochu is a Japanese company which survived kind of more than 100 years right now.
Oh, great.
And my image of kind of company which survived more than 100 years has kind of strong mission statement or philosophy, because CEO is going to change for many times, or product is going to change, whatever. So for Evernote, I don't know, like Evernote itself is gonna, product itself is gonna be changed, and probably CEO is gonna be changed. So what do you think is gonna, kind of unchanged things for Evernote to survive 100 years?
That's a really excellent question. So one of the things that taking this seriously and saying, when I build a 100-year startup does, is it forces you to think in a disciplined way about all sorts of things. And one of them is that it is my job to find a better CEO. Obviously, I can't be the last CEO of Evernote. If I am, then we failed in our mission. I still hope to be involved 100 years from now, but maybe just as a chairman or something. So there needs to be a different CEO, and it's my job to find someone, but not just to find someone who's going to be after me, to find someone who's going to be better than me. And that's an interesting amount of discipline, and I'm looking for that. And I hope that person, when he or she becomes the CEO, is already someone coming from inside of Evernote. And so there may be people at Evernote now who are going to be a better CEO than I am, and part of my job is to figure that out and mentor these people. And maybe there isn't, and I don't know exactly when it's going to happen. But if there's a better CEO in 6 months, then that will be the right time for me not to be the CEO. If it takes another 50 years, then that's okay as well. But having that discipline is important, and I think a lot of companies don't think of it in those terms, and that you kind of become a cult of personality, and there's danger there. But you're totally right. We have no idea what the products are going to look like in 100 years, because we don't know what people are going to look like in 100 years. In 100 years, I hope I'm just a head attached to like a spider robot body with lasers or something. That's my plan. But we have a very strong idea of what the brand is going to mean in 100 years. The brand is the most important thing. And so what I want Evernote brand to mean in 10 years and in 100 years is I want Evernote to be the best known company in the world for people who self-identify and aspire as being smart and being productive. I want to be Nike for smart people. I think Nike right now is the best known brand in the world for people who self-identify as being athletic, who value their bodies. And I want Evernote to be that for people who value their minds. And that's the vision. I want to be Nike for the mind. I want to be the most recognizable brand in the world 100 years from now for people who think of themselves as smarter and more productive. And I think if we focus on that, then the products will take care of themselves. The products will evolve in the correct direction. But that's what's constant, and everything else changes. That's our North Star.
So you're going to be the nerd king in a universe of nerds.
Nerd emperor.
Nerd emperor. Got it. So I'm sure we could probably sit here and talk all night, but I do believe that we have an after the session upstairs. So I very much appreciate this.
Thank you so much.
It was really a great talk. A great talk.
Thank you.